More than 700 soldiers taken down. Young men sent out with no training, armed with weapons from the 80s, fighting NATO's state-of-the-art artillery. An army lost on a battlefield they couldn't even find on a map. This is the new and shocking face of the Ukraine war. North Korea, for the first time in decades, broke its military isolation. Jong Un authorized sending thousands of soldiers to reinforce the Russian army, a risky, cruel, desperate geopolitical gamble. The result: North Korean troops facing modern war with outdated tactics, communications failing, wounded left untreated, families with no news. Diaries found in the rubble reveal many didn't even know why they were there. Others only dreamed of a hot bowl of rice. While the world watches in silence, a regime used to hiding the truth now faces something it can't control: grief. In this special episode, we'll reveal how North Korea's involvement changes the whole logic of the conflict, how it pressures global alliances, and most importantly, how far is Jong Un willing to go, sacrificing thousands of lives for political favors? And for that, we've got a guest worthy of the subject, Chris. Since we've been following this conflict from 2022, we've seen a bit of everything. But the entry of North Korean soldiers into Ukrainian territory really caught everyone off guard. North Korea spent decades practically isolated from the world, especially in military matters. How the hell did we get here?
Man, it's surreal. If you'd told me this 2 years ago, I would have laughed in your face. But what we're seeing now is the result of massive strategic pressure, both on Russia and North Korea. Jong Un, who's always taken this closed-off, almost paranoid stance toward the outside world, saw here a unique chance to step out of the shadows. Not to grab global spotlight, but to secure the survival of his regime. And Putin, completely cornered, accepted this reinforcement, even knowing the human cost would be brutal for both sides.
And Chris, this change really was abrupt. Out of nowhere, we had reports of huge military convoys leaving North Korea, crossing into Russia, and soon after, confirmation of their soldiers fighting directly in eastern Ukraine. That breaks a tradition of secrecy and self-reliance that's been there since the Korean division back in the 50s.
Exactly. It's like they broke a sacred code that had stood for over 70 years. The North Korean regime has always been obsessed with internal control, terrified that outside influence might corrupt their official narrative. Now, by sending troops into a war that isn't theirs, in totally foreign territory, they're exposing their men and, in a way, the whole propaganda machine. And for a government that survives on myths and propaganda, that's extremely dangerous. It shows way more desperation than smart strategy.
And the symbolism is massive. North Korea, which always prided itself on keeping its disputes at home or in the past, is now actively taking part in a modern conflict beyond its borders. That changes a lot, even for internal opinion, right?
It completely changes the game. Just imagine the cultural and psychological shock for these soldiers. Many of these guys never left their hometowns, some never even left their provinces. Suddenly, they're facing modern combat, in a faraway country, against a well-trained enemy armed with cutting-edge Western tech. 4 people raised to believe North Korea was untouchable and self-reliant. That reality check can be devastating.
And then there's the human cost. We'll dive deeper into that later. But what's known so far is that the death toll is massive, especially in the first weeks of fighting. Recent numbers show that out of the first troops sent, about 25% have already become casualties, killed or wounded. That's an insanely high price for a regime that's always avoided exposing its failures.
It's the biggest contradiction possible. Jong Un wanted to show strength and solidarity with Putin, but he ended up exposing his troops' total fragility. South Korean and Western intel sources estimate that out of the roughly 12,000 soldiers first sent, around 4,000 have already been killed or wounded, with some reports pointing to even higher numbers. Losing that many soldiers in such a short time, even if the regime tries to hide it, eventually leaks out. That sparks whispers, fear, even distrust within the military itself. And an authoritarian regime lives off control, but nothing is harder to control than collective grief.
And what we see now is an interesting ripple effect. North Korea's entry changes the dynamics of the international conflict. but it also exposes cracks inside their regime that maybe weren't visible before. Let's now explore the profile of the soldiers who were sent into this situation.
Exactly. Because when you look closely at who these fighters are, what stands out most is the total improvisation of the operation. Many are young, some not even 20, with zero real combat experience, trained with equipment and tactics that are literally decades old. It feels like they were sent more as political bargaining chips than as an actual effective fighting force. And in modern combat, that's basically asking to lose before the fight even starts.
And talking about these fighters, Chris, it really seems like a lot of these young soldiers were just thrown onto the front lines with zero preparation for 21st century combat. Is that really the case?
That's totally the case. And look, it's not just lack of technical training. It's the total absence of any real foundation for this kind of combat. We're talking about kids, many under 20, drilled with tactics and weapons straight out of the 80s, thrown into a battlefield full of autonomous drones, thermal sensors, and AI-guided munitions. The tech gap is so brutal it's almost cruel.
It does sound cruel when you put that way. And the reports from the field say they just freeze when faced with the unexpected. Many don't even know how to react when a hacked-up commercial drone flies over them, or when a GPS-guided precision artillery strike hits. It's literally like bringing a sword to a missile fight. Right?
That's exactly the analogy. I always say there's a massive multi-generation tech gap between them and what's being used at the front today. And the problem is, their opponent, Ukrainians with full NATO backing, knows this perfectly well. They can quickly identify who the North Korean fighters are and systematically exploit those weaknesses. It's basically an asymmetric situation disguised as an alliance of equals.
And there's something else that really strikes me. Many of these soldiers come from families that honestly believe their sons are defending the homeland against imperialist enemies, when in reality they're being used as reinforcements in a fight that isn't even theirs. That psychological factor must weigh a lot.
It weighs a ton, man. They don't even have enough time to process the real reason they were sent there. And once they finally face the brutal reality, freezing cold they've never felt, a totally foreign language, locals who are hostile, tech that looks like science fiction to them, the shock is absolutely crushing. Many mentally collapse in the first weeks of combat. It's like being dropped into a nightmare with no way to wake up.
And that lack of prep directly impacts performance on missions. A lot of field reports say they fail at basic coordination, make rookie mistakes in tactical positioning, and even get lost using simple digital maps because they don't know how to use basic modern devices.
That's completely true, and it's a direct result of decades of isolation. North Korea's military doctrine is still literally based on manuals that the rest of the world would call museum pieces. Transitioning into a fifth-generation battlefield, with electronic warfare, real-time satellite surveillance, and instant response coordination, requires way more than courage and discipline. It requires advanced technical training, and they just don't have it.
What blows my mind is that, even with all these obvious weaknesses, they're still being sent in large numbers. It's like the regime is literally willing to burn through these lives just to keep up an appearance of strength before the world.
Sadly, that's exactly what's happening. They're being used as disposable cannon fodder. The North Korean regime is betting on raw numbers, hoping that somehow makes up for the total lack of quality. But in the real world of modern warfare, that math just doesn't work. And the human cost, as we'll see in the next block, has been absolutely devastating for everyone involved.
Chris, when we talk about modern combat, it's not just about having newer weapons, right? It's also about instant communication, real-time data integration, flawless coordination between different units. How are these North Korean soldiers handling those demands?
In real practice, they're simply not handling them. This is one of their weakest and most exposed points on the field. They struggle massively with any kind of modern digital comms system. Many don't even know how to operate basic digital radios, let alone tactical navigation tablets or remote command and control systems. In several documented cases, it's the Russian soldiers themselves who have to run the equipment for them, which creates this insane dependency.
That must completely compromise any operation, right? Without effective and instant communication. You can't sync attack. Defense. Retreat. Nothing. And from what it seems, this technological lag is costing lives needlessly.
It really is, and brutally so. There have already been several reports of entire North Korean units wiped out simply because they couldn't react in time to obvious threats. Without efficient, coordinated communication, they become extremely easy targets. And this gets dramatically worse when you combine the technological deficiency with their insistence on completely outdated tactics, exposed linear marches, predictable block movements, total absence of modern aerial reconnaissance. Stuff that might have worked back in Korea's situation in the 50s, but nowadays is literally suicidal.
It sounds like they're completely stuck in time. Like a military time machine. And the worst part is that this kind of rigid doctrine might look disciplined and impressive from the outside. But in real combat practice, it's absolutely disastrous in modern asymmetric scenarios. Have you seen this in other conflicts?
Yeah, I saw something very similar at the start of operations in Iraq, in the early 2000s. Troops following outdated military protocols, with zero ability to quickly adapt to the modern battlefield. But in North Korea's case, it's way worse, because their total isolation created a bubble where modern combat just never arrived. They literally train for a type of war that hasn't existed for decades. And when the brutal reality finally hits, it hits full force, with no mercy.
And even so, the regime keeps obsessively insisting on these outdated practices. It's almost more ideological than practical, keeping those tactics and doctrines alive. Right?
That's exactly it. For Kim Jong Un and the regime's leadership, changing those core practices would be like admitting publicly that the West was right all along about military modernization. And for an authoritarian government that literally survives on the illusion of superiority and self-sufficiency, that's totally unacceptable. So they'd rather consciously waste precious human lives than adjust their doctrine and admit mistakes. And the real battlefield charges that ideological cost with zero mercy or political consideration.
Recently, for the first time in history, Kim Jong Un publicly admitted the losses, honoring 100 fallen soldiers in an official ceremony, though intelligence sources say the real numbers are way higher. In the end, this toxic mix of communication failures with completely outdated tactics creates the perfect setup for mass human tragedy.
Exactly, and that's where the real human cost starts becoming even clearer and more painful. With estimates of 5,000 casualties, this conflict has already become the third deadliest in North Korea's history, surpassing even their involvement in the Vietnam War. When you mix total improvisation with decades of technological lag and complete tactical unpreparedness, the result can only be one thing: massive, unnecessary losses. And the most tragic part is that these are young lives that could be building a better future for their country instead of being used as disposable pieces on a geopolitical chessboard they can't even begin to understand.
It's a situation that exposes the deep contradictions of authoritarian regimes when they're confronted with modern reality. Ideological rigidity clashes brutally with real-world demands. And the ones who pay the price are always the youngest and most vulnerable. Chris, everybody already knows North Korea's losses in Ukraine have been brutal since the start. But what really shocks me is the speed with which everything collapsed. We're talking about soldiers sent there, and within hours they were already being wiped out.
It's terrifying, man. Look, I saw a lot of conflict in my career, but what happened with those North Korean kids was almost criminal. Think about it, they arrived in October 2024, around 11,000 men, and in just 3 months they lost 40% of the entire force. We're talking more than 4,000 casualties in a ridiculously short period.
And that info is confirmed.
Yeah, multiple sources. Kim Jong Un himself admitted the losses for the first time in a recent ceremony, something that had never happened before. He mentioned 100 soldiers dead, but the real numbers are way higher. Ukrainian President Zelensky talked about over 3,000 dead and wounded, and independent analyses put it closer to 4,000 total casualties.
That's almost a third of the whole force. What explains this bloodbath?
Man, it's the perfect storm for disaster. First, these soldiers came from an army that hasn't faced real conflict in decades. North Korea's been technically at peace since 1953. Second, they were thrown against forces that have been training with NATO gear for years. It's like taking someone who's only ever played soccer on PlayStation and throwing them into a World Cup final.
And did the North Koreans themselves acknowledge this?
In a way, yeah. Captured documents show they were trying to learn the hard way. A notebook found on a dead soldier had instructions on how to deal with drones, something they'd never seen before. The guy wrote that one soldier should act as bait to lure the drone while others tried to shoot it down. That's a desperate tactic from people with zero tech to defend themselves.
That reminds me of what happened to US soldiers going into Vietnam. You know, that initial confidence that quickly turns into panic when you realize you don't know the terrain or the enemy.
The comparison is good, but with the North Koreans it's even harsher. In Vietnam, our soldiers had logistical support, comms, medevac. These kids were dumped there with outdated gear, no proper night vision, no anti-drone systems. It was basically a death sentence.
And that must have crushed morale pretty quickly, I imagine.
Totally. Reports started coming in of soldiers refusing to leave trenches, others trying to surrender, which is unthinkable in North Korean mentality. When you've been trained your whole life to blindly obey and suddenly you see your buddies getting shredded by tech you don't even understand, the mind just collapses.
And the regime tried to hide these losses?
At first, yeah. Total silence. But eventually it was impossible. Families themselves started asking questions. The absence of their sons was too obvious. And now, for the first time ever, Kim Jong Un held a public ceremony acknowledging combat deaths abroad. That shows how far out of control the situation's gotten.
Chris, one thing that really gets to me in all this are the diaries and personal notes found with North Korean soldiers. Did you get access to some of that material?
Yeah, and man, it's heartbreaking. Those documents show a reality totally different from the propaganda. One diary I read literally said, "I had never heard of Ukraine until I was drafted." Another soldier wrote about missing his mom and how strange it felt fighting alongside Russians who didn't even talk to them.
That humanizes a situation we often only see as numbers. Right? Death stats. Wounded stats.
Exactly. The language in those diaries is simple, but loaded with fear and loneliness. They don't write like trained soldiers, they write like scared sons, like boys away from home for the first time. One passage that stuck with me was, "I dreamed of hot rice tonight." It sounds silly, but it speaks of deprivation, of longing, of despair.
And many of those diaries end abruptly. Right?
Yeah, and that's the most disturbing part. You're reading the words of a 19 or 20-year-old kid, talking about home, about fear, and suddenly the pages just stop. It's like the war silenced not only their bodies but their voices too.
Do these stories manage to get past the info blockade inside North Korea?
For now, very little. But the regime's worried. Because once those stories start circulating inside, even through underground channels, they'll erode the whole propaganda base. It's more dangerous to Kim Jong Un than any Western missile.
And there's this interesting detail. Many of those soldiers didn't even know exactly where they were. Right?
Exactly. Some accounts show soldiers who thought they were fighting South Koreans, not Ukrainians. Russian commanders even lied to them, saying there were South Korean troops in the Kursk region. It's disinformation within disinformation.
That creates a level of confusion that must be psychologically devastating.
No doubt. Imagine, you're raised your whole life to hate South Korea, you're sent to a place you've never heard of, fighting alongside people who don't speak your language, against enemies you don't even know why you're fighting. That's the perfect recipe for mental collapse.
Chris, North Korea has always based its social control on the idea that serving the regime is protecting your family. But now those same families are being destroyed by this decision to send their kids to Ukraine.
It's the ultimate contradiction of the system. For decades, the regime preached, "Do this for the good of your family, for their protection." And now it's the regime itself destroying those families. Many parents haven't heard from their sons in months. No letters, no official visits, nothing.
And that uncertainty must be even crueler than knowing their son is dead. Right?
No doubt. It's a kind of suffering that paralyzes, but also plants dangerous seeds. Did my son die? Was he abandoned? Was it worth it? Those questions corrode any sense of purpose, and that's lethal for a regime that survives on total obedience.
How's the government dealing with those families?
Very cautiously. Rumors say some families are being watched more closely, others relocated to different cities. The regime's afraid grief could turn into revolt. And in a society where control is absolute, even a small crack can become a bigger fracture.
And now, with Kim Jong Un holding that public ceremony admitting deaths, does that change anything?
It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, he's trying to control the narrative, spin those deaths as heroism. On the other, it's the first time he's publicly admitted North Korean soldiers are dying on foreign soil. That opens up dangerous precedents.
Precedents like what?
Families may start questioning why their sons had to die for a cause that isn't theirs. The usual propaganda of defending the homeland doesn't work when your soldiers are dying thousands of miles away, in a place most of them never even knew existed.
And there's the economic side too, right? These families lost their main breadwinners.
Exactly. Many of those soldiers were supporting their households. In North Korea's fragile economy, losing a son who sent money home is devastating. And so far, there's no sign the regime is compensating these families adequately.
That creates resentment that can sit dormant for a long time.
And that's exactly what worries the regime. Silent resentment can explode at any moment. All it takes is a trigger, a bigger info leak, a scandal, an economic crisis for it to spill over. And when it spills over in authoritarian regimes, it's always unpredictable and violent.
What strikes me is that we're seeing, maybe for the first time, the North Korean regime dealing with the real consequences of its military decisions in real time.
Exactly. For decades, they lived in a bubble of empty threats and provocations with no real consequences. Now they're paying a heavy price in human lives, and that price is being paid by the very families that were always the regime's support base.
And that takes us to a bigger question about how modern conflicts affect not just fighters, but the whole social fabric they come from.
Exactly. Modern conflict doesn't end on the battlefield. It continues in hospitals, in empty homes, in broken families. And North Korea, which always hid itself from those realities, is now being forced to face them head-on. It's a reality check that could have long-lasting consequences for the regime itself.
Chris, there's something that really bothers me when we think about this whole situation. The conflict doesn't end when the explosions stop. And now we have to face a brutal reality. What happens when these soldiers come back home wounded? Does North Korea have any capacity to treat the kinds of injuries we see in modern combat?
Look, this is one of the most tragic parts of the whole story. Based on what we know about North Korea's medical infrastructure, the answer is a categorical no. Most of the country's hospitals are still running with equipment from the 70s and 80s. We're talking about injuries caused by explosive drones, modern artillery fragmentation, chemical burns. It's 21st century battlefield medicine being treated with 20th century resources.
It's hard to even picture that. And from the numbers we're seeing, about 4,000 soldiers dead or wounded according to Western officials. That must be creating insane pressure on the country's medical system. Right?
Totally. Kim Jong Un, for the first time, publicly admitted losses of North Korean troops in Ukraine, honoring 100 dead soldiers, but we know the real numbers are much higher. The few military facilities that have any level of preparation are already completely overwhelmed. I've heard unconfirmed reports of makeshift hospitals being set up in industrial warehouses, with zero basic hygiene conditions. Imagine trying to perform a complex surgery on a soldier with explosive injuries in a place with no proper sterilization.
And what really shocks me is that even with that situation, troops keep being sent out. You mentioned around 12,000 soldiers total, according to US and Ukrainian intelligence. How does a government knowingly create more wounded when it knows it can't take care of them?
That's the most inhumane part of this whole operation. The official propaganda keeps glorifying these soldiers as national heroes, but those same heroes are basically forgotten once they return home. Many come back with amputated limbs, with deep psychological trauma, and they don't get any proper medical or psychological support. It's like, in order to keep the official narrative running, these people just have to disappear from public sight.
But tell me something. Chris, how does communication with the families work? Because those families must be desperate for news. Right?
And that's where one of the cruelest aspects of this whole operation comes in. According to North Korean defectors who managed to escape to South Korea, the regime probably kept the deployment of these soldiers completely secret, even from their own families. Imagine the situation: one day your son is at home, the next day he's just gone with no explanation. Families are left totally in the dark.
That's psychologically devastating. And when that information eventually leaks, what must the impact be?
That's when it gets really dark. Intelligence experts suggest Kim Jong Un has already isolated families who showed anxiety or concern about their son's whereabouts. We're talking social control at the most basic and cruel level, using the suffering of families themselves as a tool for political control.
And that must create a terrible domino effect inside North Korean society. Right? Because these people are returning to their villages, their families, carrying these very visible scars.
Exactly. Those scars walk the streets, they talk to neighbors, to relatives. And that's a real danger for the regime. Because the more wounded soldiers come back, the harder it becomes to hide that something went very, very wrong. Collective pain starts replacing the fear that keeps the system running. And in a regime like North Korea's, that's literally an existential threat to established power.
Now, Chris, there's something I'm really curious about. What happens to the soldiers who are captured? Because from what we know, there are already North Korean prisoners in Ukrainian hands.
That's a very complex humanitarian situation. The captured soldiers don't speak Ukrainian, English, or even fluent Russian. Communication has been happening through Korean interpreters, often with the help of South Korean intelligence services. Reports say those soldiers show up injured and extremely terrified.
Terrified of being captured. Or something else.
Of something much darker. North Korean defectors revealed that all recruits are taught a military song that includes a verse about saving the last bullet for themselves, to avoid capture. More than that, they're explicitly warned by their commanders that if they're captured and reveal information to the enemy, their families will be punished, sent to political prison camps, or worse, publicly executed as an example.
Man, that's psychological terrorism at its most basic level. How does a soldier even cope with that kind of pressure?
It's a kind of mind control that goes beyond what we can imagine in the West. These soldiers aren't just fighting an external enemy, they're carrying the lives of their entire families on their backs. Every decision on the battlefield could mean life or death not just for them, but for their parents, siblings, wives, kids left behind. It's a form of institutionalized emotional blackmail.
Now, Chris, despite this grim picture, we've got interesting reports that some North Korean groups have started adapting on the battlefield. From being easy targets, they've become opponents that are actually tough to deal with. What changed in the equation?
The battlefield is brutal, but it's also the fastest learning environment in the world. Either you adapt, or you don't come back. And the North Koreans, despite their technological backwardness, have one trait you can't underestimate: iron discipline. They started carefully observing how Russian troops operate, studied the flight patterns of Ukrainian drones, and gradually began adopting new tactics, some surprisingly creative.
So can we say they're starting to play the modern game?
Turner, in large part, yeah. Some platoons started using smokescreens much more intelligently, creating movement corridors that confused drone operators. Others began building elaborate camouflage nets using local materials. The most impressive thing is that they learned to operate basic observation drones, some even adapting old smartphones for that purpose. It's evolution born of desperation, but evolution nonetheless.
That shows an adaptability that was completely underestimated at the start of the conflict, right?
No doubt. Everyone expected them to just be numbers, disposable resources to soak up enemy fire. But that same discipline and rigidity that first got in the way of adapting started serving as a solid base for a kind of improvised training on the battlefield. The problem is, It doesn't solve fundamental issues like the lack of modern comms gear and heavy weapons, but it already changes the tactical game significantly on several fronts.
And tell me, Chris, how does this compare to other conflicts you've studied? Is this ability to adapt common?
Actually, it's not as common as it sounds. Most military forces facing superior tech just disintegrate or retreat. What makes the North Koreans unique is this mix of extreme discipline with a willingness to sacrifice that goes way beyond normal rationality. They're literally learning hands-on how to fight modern drones with improvised techniques.
And that might explain why. In some regions, we've started hearing reports of North Korean units genuinely being feared by Ukrainians.
Exactly. Once they find their rhythm, they turn into an unpredictable force. They're not technologically sophisticated, but they're absolutely relentless. When you combine that with a military doctrine that embraces total sacrifice, the enemy starts hesitating. They've learned to move like ghosts, strike in coordinated, silent attacks, and retreat with an efficiency that even surprises veteran Russians. That battlefield transformation genuinely scares opponents.
Now, there's something that really intrigues me. How did those soldiers react when they realized where they really were? Because from what we know, many thought it was just a military drill.
That's one of the most shocking revelations of the whole story. Many North Korean soldiers really believed they were just taking part in routine military exercises with the Russians. When they realized they were in real combat, facing an enemy shooting to kill, it must have been a brutal psychological shock. Imagine discovering you were lied to, and you're literally fighting for your life in foreign territory.
How did that not lead to mass mutiny or desertions?
Because of that control system we mentioned earlier. Even after finding out the truth, they know desertion means a death sentence for their families. It's a perfectly cruel system they can't escape, because that would destroy the lives of the people they love most. So they're trapped between two terrible options: fight in a war they weren't prepared for, or condemn their families.
And that psychological factor, in the middle of combat, can be decisive in flipping the outcome of a clash. Right?
Absolutely. Sometimes the psychological impact weighs way more than raw firepower. And the North Koreans, despite all the losses they're suffering, have started exploiting that psychological aspect with a calculated coldness that even surprises the Russians fighting alongside them.
And here we get to a fascinating point. Chris, military discipline, when we compare it with the Russian troops, who are often criticized for problems of organization and low morale. The North Koreans seem to come from a completely different universe.
The difference is striking. Russian forces have well-documented chronic problems: indiscipline, heavy drinking, mass desertions, questioning of orders. The North Koreans are literally the complete opposite. They're cold, methodical, they follow orders to the very last consequence without questioning. That makes them more predictable in some ways, but also much more dangerous when given the right instructions.
And how are the Russians themselves reacting to that difference in posture?
According to field reports, at first there was skepticism. Russian commanders were used to troops questioning orders, sometimes flat out refusing to advance. Suddenly, they've got soldiers next to them who carry out any order without hesitation. That's creating an interesting dynamic and, to be honest, a bit of a disturbing one.
And we've got reports of tactics that shocked even experienced Ukrainian fighters. Right? Things like using human decoys. Soldiers blowing themselves up with grenades to avoid capture.
Unfortunately, those reports seem to be true, though it's important to say not all can be fully verified in a combat zone. It's the kind of tactic that only works when a soldier has loyalty that goes beyond normal rationality. In my opinion, based on decades of military experience, they've been conditioned to choose death over capture. Many carry hidden grenades specifically to blow themselves up if surrounded.
How does a Ukrainian commander deal with that? It must be psychologically crushing to face soldiers willing to die in such a calculated way.
A Ukrainian commander fighting in the region said publicly, "They don't surrender." It's a simple phrase, but it carries enormous psychological weight. When you know you're facing soldiers who prefer death to capture, that completely changes your combat tactics. You can't count on the enemy retreating or giving up when things get tough.
It's impressive how this devotion to Kim Jong Un literally shapes every battlefield decision. They are not fighting just for territory or military objectives, but for an ideology, for a personality cult.
And that's probably the hardest thing to fight militarily. You can neutralize a well-armed enemy with superior tactics, but you can't neutralize someone genuinely willing to die for a narrative they fully believe in. That blind loyalty is at the same time the greatest military asset and the greatest human tragedy of these troops.
Chris, now tell me something. How is this situation affecting the international perception of North Korea? Because for decades they were seen as an isolated threat. But now, they're actively participating in a global conflict.
This is a fundamental geopolitical shift. For decades, North Korea's strategy was develop nukes and be left alone. Now, according to former US officials, Kim Jong Un isn't satisfied just being left alone. He wants to be an active player on the world stage. And that completely changes the global power game.
What does that mean for countries like South Korea and Japan, who are literally in the neighborhood?
It's a huge source of concern. South Korea especially is seeing this as legitimizing North Korea's weapons program. Every soldier gaining combat experience in Ukraine is potentially a much more dangerous soldier if conflict breaks out on the Korean peninsula. It's real military experience, not simulations or exercises.
And there's also the issue of workers, right? Because it's not just soldiers North Korea is sending to Russia.
Exactly. The BBC reported that more than 10,000 North Korean workers were sent to labor under conditions described as slavery in construction and other Russian sectors. That completely violates UN sanctions banning the use of North Korean labor. It's like Kim Jong Un is using his own citizens as bargaining chips to strengthen his alliance with Putin.
And in the end, this brings us back to the center of all this, Kim Jong Un. Every soldier sent, every life lost, every order given on the battlefield, it all converges on a single figure.
Exactly. Kim Jong Un acknowledged for the first time the losses of North Korean troops, saying his heart aches, but the reality is those losses are part of a much bigger political calculation. We're seeing not just a military operation, but a social and political experiment that could define the future of the North Korean regime itself.
But tell me, Chris, what's his calculation? Because objectively, he's losing soldiers, spending resources, creating internal instability. What's he gaining from this?
Several things. First, real military experience for his troops. Second, Russian military technology in exchange for support. Third, and maybe most important, he's positioning himself as a valuable ally in an increasingly polarized world. He doesn't just want to be the isolated madman with nukes anymore, he wants to be seen as a relevant strategic partner.
And that works as a kind of political life insurance for him?
In a way, yes. The more useful he is to Russia, the less likely he is to be abandoned if things get tough. It's a survival strategy at the international level. The problem is, that strategy is being paid for with the blood of his own soldiers.
The implications of that decision go way beyond what we can see today on the battlefield. We're talking about the future of an entire country, millions of people, depending on the choices of a single man.
And that's exactly why we need to keep following this story closely. Because the consequences of this decision won't be limited to Ukraine's borders or North Korea's borders. They could echo across global geopolitics for decades. We're seeing the birth of a new authoritarian alliance that could redefine the global balance of power.
And for the families of those soldiers, still in total darkness about the fate of their sons, husbands, brothers, this is a human tragedy that goes way beyond politics.
Exactly. At the end of the day, behind every number, every statistic, every geopolitical analysis, there are real people. Families who don't know if their loved ones are alive or dead. Soldiers who discovered they'd been deceived and are now fighting for survival in foreign territory. Wounded men coming home without the treatment they need. It's easy to get lost in the strategic analysis and forget we're talking about real human lives.
And that reminds us that, at the end of the day, all these grand political strategies come with a human cost that rarely shows up in the main headlines. Chris, after everything we've talked about so far, It's time to ask the big question. Why the hell did Kim Jong Un make this decision? Why send thousands of young North Koreans to die in trenches on the other side of the world, in a conflict that has absolutely nothing to do with them?
Man, that's the billion-dollar question, literally. And look, after years analyzing authoritarian regimes, I'll tell you, Kim's decision is pure desperation disguised as strategy. He looked at North Korea's situation, wrecked economy, starving population, outdated military tech, and saw in Putin's Russia the last lifeline.
But let's talk facts here. Because this isn't speculation. We're talking real numbers. Chris, how many North Korean soldiers were actually sent?
The numbers are frightening when you stop to think. US and Ukrainian intelligence confirm about 12,000 North Korean soldiers were sent to Russia starting in October 2024. Out of those, at least 4,000 have already been killed or wounded. That's a third of the troops in just a few months of fighting. To put it in perspective, that's a casualty rate that would make any military commander lose sleep.
And here's where it gets even more dramatic, right? Because recently, for the first time ever, Kim Jong Un publicly admitted those losses. He held an official ceremony in Pyongyang a few days ago, crying on camera for the fallen soldiers.
Exactly, and that's absolutely unprecedented. The North Korean regime never, ever admits failures or military losses. State propaganda always sold the idea that the North Korean army is invincible, that Kim Jong Un is an infallible military genius. But now, on camera, he's crying, saying his heart aches for the families of the dead soldiers. That's not just an admission of defeat, it's a sign internal pressure has reached a level he can't ignore anymore.
And let's be honest, these aren't just cold statistics. We're talking about 22-year-old kids, many of them who had never even left North Korea, suddenly thrown into modern combat against Ukrainian drones, precision artillery, tech they'd never seen in their lives.
It's a bloodbath foretold. These boys were trained for a military reality from the 1950s. They have no real combat experience. The last time North Korea faced something like this was back during the 1953 armistice talks. Now they're facing one of the most technologically advanced, brutal situations in modern combat. It's like sending World War II soldiers to fight with medieval weapons.
And here comes Kim Jong Un's cruel political calculation. He's not sending those soldiers to Russia out of ideology or socialist brotherhood. He's literally selling their lives in exchange for oil, food, and advanced weapons.
That's exactly it. Intelligence reports show North Korea is receiving Russian military tech, including advanced missile systems, in exchange for those troops. On top of that, millions of tons of grain and fuel. For Kim Jong Un, it's a simple business transaction. He's got excess young male population, and Russia needs cannon fodder. The problem is, he completely underestimated the internal political cost of this decision.
Because it's one thing to send professional soldiers, career military who know the risks. It's something totally different to take kids doing mandatory service and ship them into real combat without even telling their families what's going on.
And that's Kim's biggest miscalculation. He thought he could do it in secret, that families wouldn't find out, that information wouldn't leak. But today, with smuggled cell phones, with information flowing through China, those families are finding out the truth in fragmented, painful ways. They're learning their sons died not defending the homeland, but fighting in a situation they can't even fully understand.
And that brings us to the central point of this whole conversation. For the first time in decades, Kim Jong Un looks vulnerable. The image of the infallible leader is cracking. Chris, let's talk about something few analysts are openly discussing. Is there a real possibility that this decision to send troops to Ukraine could destabilize Kim Jong Un's regime internally?
Look, a few months ago, I would have said the possibility was practically zero. The North Korean regime is one of the most efficient control machines ever built in human history. But now, for the first time in a long time, I see real cracks in the structure. And not small cracks.
What kind of cracks are we talking about? Because let's be clear, we're not talking about protests in Pyongyang streets or public demonstrations.
No, of course not. In regimes like this, dissent never starts with public protests. It starts with whispers, with looks, with small acts of disobedience that go unnoticed. What we're seeing now are preliminary signs, families asking questions they never asked before, military officers beginning to question orders internally, a population that for the first time is seeing the regime can make fatal mistakes.
And there's a very strong psychological aspect here, right? Because the regime always sold the idea that following the supreme leader's orders guaranteed safety and protection for your family. But now those same families are seeing that following those orders could mean the death of their children.
Exactly. It's the breaking of the implicit social contract. The regime said, "Obey without question and we guarantee you and your families will be safe." But now thousands of families are discovering their sons didn't die defending North Korea, but defending Russian interests in a situation they can't even understand. That breaks fundamental trust in the system.
And the ceremony Kim Jong Un held recently, crying for the fallen soldiers, didn't seem to convince anyone, right? On the contrary, many analysts are saying it was an admission of weakness.
It backfired. The idea was to show he cares about the soldiers, that he's a compassionate leader. But what the population saw was a leader publicly admitting he made a grave mistake. In a regime where the leader's infallibility is one of the pillars of legitimacy, that's devastating. It's like the Catholic Pope admitting publicly he's not sure God exists.
And there's another factor we can't ignore. North Korea's economy was already in ruins before this military adventure. Now, with the loss of thousands of young workers, the situation only got worse.
That's crucial. North Korea already had a silent demographic crisis, shrinking youth population, aging workforce. Now they've lost thousands of young men in their productive years in a totally unnecessary situation from an internal economic perspective. It's like burning money while your house is on fire.
But let's be realistic here. Chris, Kim Jong Un still has control. He still has the security apparatus. He still has the army loyal to him. What would be the real scenario for a power shift?
You're right, he still has control. But for the first time in decades, that control doesn't look absolute. The most likely scenario wouldn't be a popular revolution, but an internal regime shift. High-ranking military officers, workers' party members, people in the inner circle beginning to question if Kim Jong Un is still the best option for the regime's survival.
And historically, that's how authoritarian regimes fall, right? Not by popular uprisings, but by internal coups when the ruling elite loses confidence in the leader.
Exactly. Stalin died surrounded by people who feared him but secretly wished for his death. Ceausescu in Romania was toppled when his own generals turned against him. Kim Jong Un isn't there yet, but for the first time, it's possible to imagine scenarios where members of the North Korean elite begin considering alternatives.
And here's an interesting detail. For the first time, Kim Jong Un is facing a situation where he can't blame external forces for internal problems. This was his decision, purely his.
That's key. Traditionally, the regime could always blame the United States, South Korea, Western imperialism for all internal problems. But now, when families are mourning their dead, they know it was Kim Jong Un's specific decision to send their sons to die in a foreign war. There's no way to externalize the blame this time.
Now let's zoom out and look at the bigger geopolitical board. Because what's happening in North Korea doesn't just affect the Korean peninsula. The whole world is recalculating its strategies because of this move by Kim Jong Un.
No doubt. And look, it's interesting because Kim Jong Un thought he was making a master move, strengthening ties with Russia, gaining advanced military technology, showing strategic relevance. But what he actually did was the opposite. He exposed the regime's internal weaknesses to the entire world and created dangerous precedents.
Let's talk concrete numbers here. According to South Korean intelligence reports released this week, out of the North Korean troops sent, about 600 soldiers have already been confirmed dead, and thousands are wounded. We're talking about a death rate that surpasses many historical conflicts.
It's terrifying when you put it in perspective. For comparison, the United States lost about 400 soldiers in 20 years of conflict in Afghanistan. North Korea lost 600 confirmed soldiers in just a few months, in a situation that has absolutely nothing to do with North Korean national security. It's needless carnage.
And there's another aspect I think is important to highlight. These North Korean soldiers aren't fighting as professional mercenaries. Many of them were sent without even knowing exactly where they were going or what they were going to do.
That makes the situation even more tragic. Reports from captured soldiers show that many were told they were going to training exercises in Russia, not to real combat. Imagine the psychological state of those young men. They leave home thinking they're going to a training drill and find themselves in the middle of one of the most brutal conflicts of the 21st century, facing kamikaze drones, precision artillery, urban combat situations they've never trained for.
And that raises an important ethical question that few are discussing. To what extent can these soldiers even be considered legitimate combatants if they were sent under false information?
It's a complex question under international law. Technically, they're combatants because they're in uniform and armed. But morally, it's very complicated. Many of these young men are, essentially, victims just as much as the Ukrainian civilians being attacked. They were deceived by their own government and thrown into a deadly situation.
And how is this affecting international perception of North Korea? Because until now, the country was seen as a regional threat, but relatively contained.
Now North Korea has become a direct actor in a global conflict. That completely changes the geopolitical dynamic. South Korea, Japan, the United States all are reconsidering their containment strategies. It's no longer just about ballistic missiles pointed at Seoul or Tokyo, it's about the capacity to project military power into global conflicts.
But let's be honest about military performance. From everything we know, the North Korean troops aren't doing well on the battlefield, right?
It's a complete military disaster. These troops were trained for a totally different military reality. They know mass tactics, conventional combat, but they have zero experience with modern combat situations. Drones, electronic warfare, coordination with Russian forces speaking a different language, it's a recipe for disaster.
And ironically, that poor military performance might be what saves Kim Jong Un's regime in the short term, because it shows North Korean generals that an external military adventure would be suicide.
Interesting point. That could be true. North Korean generals are seeing in real time that their troops they thought were well trained, are being massacred by Ukrainian forces. That could discourage any idea of military conflict on the Korean peninsula.
But what about the relationship with China? Because traditionally, China has always been North Korea's great protector. And now Kim Jong Un is moving closer and closer to Russia.
China is not happy with this at all. Beijing always preferred a stable, predictable North Korea as a buffer zone. Now they've got an unstable ally involving itself in global conflicts and creating diplomatic problems. China is in a very uncomfortable position. They can't completely abandon North Korea, but they also can't endorse this military adventure.
And there's an aspect I think is crucial. For first time, the North Korean regime is facing internal opposition based not on ideology, but on very practical and emotional grounds, families who lost sons.
Exactly. Ideology can be fought with more ideology, propaganda with more propaganda. But family grief, the pain of losing a child, that you can't fight with speeches. It's visceral pain that no political system can erase or completely reinterpret.
And looking ahead, Chris, what's your prognosis? Can Kim Jong Un overcome this internal crisis? Or are we seeing the beginning of the end for this regime?
Look, in the short term, I believe he can stay in power. The security apparatus is still very strong. The population still has no organized means of resistance. But this decision created a wound in North Korea's social fabric that will be very hard to heal. For the first time in decades, there's a real emotional basis for questioning the regime.
And that emotional basis is powerful because it doesn't come from intellectuals or political dissidents, but from ordinary mothers and fathers who lost their children.
Exactly. These are people with no political agenda, who followed the system's rules, who believed the official propaganda. But now they have a personal and profound reason to question everything. And that kind of questioning is far more dangerous to an authoritarian regime than any organized political movement.
One last reflection. Chris, do you think Kim Jong Un really grasped the internal consequences of this decision when he made it?
I honestly believe he didn't. He made a purely geopolitical and economic calculation, thinking about short-term benefits like military technology and natural resources. But he completely underestimated the internal emotional and social impact. It was the decision of a leader who was very isolated from the reality of his own people.
And that could be his fatal mistake, because in authoritarian regimes, the leader's isolation from social reality is often the prelude to collapse.
History is full of examples like that. Leaders making decisions based on filtered information, losing touch with the real sentiment of the population, underestimating the power of basic human pain. Kim Jong Un may have just made the same mistake that brought down other dictators throughout history.
And the irony is, he did it trying to strengthen the regime, but may have created the conditions for his own downfall.
Exactly. Sometimes, in trying to save their power, authoritarian leaders create exactly the conditions that can destroy them. And in Kim Jong Un's case, he did it in a very public, very painful way for thousands of families who once were loyal to the system.
Chris, after everything we've discussed, one question echoes strongly. How far can a leader go in sacrificing his citizens in the name of strategy?
That's the central question. Because deep down, every war carries that dilemma. But in North Korea's case, we're talking about a silent sacrifice, no debate, no choice. These young men were sent without understanding why, without knowing where they were going. They died for an idea they may not even have understood. And that exposes the cruelest side of authoritarian politics.
And the international community? Faced with all this, does it have any real margin for action? Or are we just watching from afar? Powerless?
There are limits, of course. North Korea is closed, resistant to any form of external pressure. But there are paths strengthening humanitarian channels, encouraging defectors, systematically denouncing them in international institutions. It's not an immediate solution, but it's a form of resistance.
And maybe, more than anything, we need to keep the focus on the human stories behind the numbers. Because every number we mentioned here today has a face, a name, a family.
Exactly. War dehumanizes, it turns people into statistics. But our role is to remind everyone that behind every figure, there was a boy who dreamed of coming home. And that recognition, by itself, is already a way of resisting the logic of authoritarianism.
Thank you for this conversation. Chris, it was tough, but necessary. I think everyone who listened today leaves with more clarity and more empathy.